Hello, college fantasy football family and friends. You're watching the Week 9 podcast. My name is Joe DeSalvo. I'll be your host, and I'm coming to you up close and personal this week. Change the camera angle on you guys a little bit, close to the microphone, different look. And we're going to do a little bit of a different routine this week. Instead of just kind of coming up with the top fantasy plays from each game, we've reached a point of the season where I think what you see is what you're going to get for most of the schools now. Matchups will dictate fantasy, production will dictate what we project for fantasy production. And so we're going to get into the matchups. We're going to go conference by conference this week. But before we get into that, I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the mismatches, what you should do when you get into some situations like we had last week with Arkansas versus Arkansas Pine Bluff, Oklahoma versus Kansas. I have a really strong stance on this, and really what I'm going to share is really just reflective of some of the things that I see, some of the emails I get, and some of the discussion that goes on within the CFF Sites Discord server in regards to playing star players in really bad matchups. There's a difference of opinion, apparently, across the landscape of college fantasy football. I have an opinion on that, and I'm going to share that before we get into the matchups. I apologize for all you guys in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League. I'm not going to go into a lot of the results of that league. I know there was a little bit of a glitch on Fantrax this past week, in which one of their stat providers had one of the stat providers mislabeled one of the Western Kentucky receivers. I think it might have been Mitchell Tinsley. I think that problem has been resolved on Fantrax, but I just need to go back and double check the scoring and update the brackets that were updated at the beginning of the week, but that may have influenced or might have affected some of the outcomes, particularly in the tournament format league. So we'll get back into that next week. But before we get into the matchups, week 9, right? I mean, we are now coming into the stretch. Whether you play in a cumulative points league or head-to-head, you're coming up to the end of the season right here. It is the stretch run. If you're in a cumulative points league, maybe a best ball format, you have to go aggressive. You're going to make plays on the waiver wire this week. Over the next couple of weeks, you have to make up some ground. You're going to be targeting some of those boomer bust players. If you're doing really well right now, you're going to want to target some of the consistent players, more consistent players, or maybe you're in a situation where you're one of the top teams in your league and you just want to guard yourself from any other teams making a run at you. So maybe you pick up a good player off of the waiver wire, stack the depth on your roster, analyze the schedule down the stretch, and you're basically trying to play keep away, keep other teams from starting a late season player, a player that emerges late in the season against you. You want to protect yourself from that. So you pick up and add to your roster. That happens. But a bunch of different philosophies right now. And if you're in the middle of the pack right now, you've got to scratch a claw, find some ways to get in. Maybe that means letting go some of your bench depth and making a play for some of these 1 week wonders, some of the hidden gems. And I think that's what you have to look for if you're in the middle of the pack right now. Try to find a way to recalibrate your roster a little bit and play the matchup game week to week. Maybe pick up a player ahead of time, 1 week in advance, knowing that you may need him for the following week. A lot of different philosophies coming in right now through the emails, a lot of different advice that I'm giving out. And really a lot of it depends on not only how your roster looks, but where do you stand in the league? It's hard for me to answer every question that comes in. A little bit of, how should I start player A or player B? I'm always going to defer to the projections and the rankings when those come out, which they'll be released on the website late tonight or tomorrow. Once again, I'm recording this on a Wednesday evening, but I need a lot more context when you guys send in emails. It's nice to know whether it's PPR, non-PPR, half point PPR. How's the other roster look that you're playing against? Do you need to be aggressive? Or are you trying to play it conservative? Or are you asking me about a player in your flex spot? And really at that particular point, are you looking to play conservative? Or do you feel like you're playing someone really good and you want to be aggressive? There's a bunch of different philosophies that really dictate whether or not the advice that I give you guys. And look, sometimes, sometimes we hit, sometimes we miss. But I'd like to get as much context as possible when all of these emails come in. And so, a lot of you guys that DM me through Discord or send in the email, sometimes I'll hit you back with just a couple of questions, follow-up questions, just to get a little bit more detail, so I could give you a little bit more context around my answer and a little bit of the why. But before we get into that, and here's something that's really, I really waited a while to talk about this, because it's something that really, I guess it bothers me a little bit. When I see a lot of chatter, I get a lot of emails, or, I see a lot of discussion throughout the Discord channels about this one particular subject. And that is whether or not you should start some of your star players in games that seem to be mismatches on paper. And I really let the weekend play out, because I know I saw a lot of it. Should I start KJ Jefferson? Should I start Treylon Burks? I mean, they're playing Arkansas Pine Bluff. Jefferson threw 4 TD passes, Treylon Burks 3 total touchdowns, right? There was a lot of discussion of whether or not guys wanted to start Caleb Williams because they were worried about that game against Kansas getting out of hand, and whether or not he would have enough points by the time he came out the game. And, right now, there's nothing that can be taken for granted right now throughout college football. And here's my question when I see that is, it almost like, why, what goes through your head, or what goes through their head when they're debating not starting Treylon Burks in what is one of the easier matchups that Arkansas is going to have all year? Arkansas is they're not going to change who they are and what they do. They're not going to change their identity just because they're playing Arkansas Pine Bluff. So that was, would you rather be starting KJ Jefferson? Would you rather be starting Treylon Burks against Georgia, or would you rather start him against Arkansas Pine Bluff every week of the season? And for me, that's an easy answer. So I don't know why guys are really hesitant to start their studs against these FCS teams, against some of these really bad FBS teams. First of all, we see that anything can happen. I've said this a number of times on the podcast this year, that Oklahoma is undefeated, but they may be the most unimpressive top 5 team in the country. They could have easily have lost 5 games by now. I think they're going to struggle to run through the last 3 games that they have on their schedule. I'll be surprised if they make it. I just don't feel that they're one of the top 5 teams in the country, even with Caleb Williams at quarterback. So, that's my take on Oklahoma. But my feeling is that you cannot sit your studs even when they're playing bad teams. And look, here's the thing. There's only 2 teams, in my opinion, that I would be nervous to start my studs against, or start my studs on, if they were playing a real bad FBS opponent, or really, just an FCS opponent. And that's if you have players on Alabama and Ohio State. It just seems like over the past several years that those are the 2 teams that you have to worry about. It's not the Oklahomas. It's not anyone else that you really have to worry about. Start your studs every week. And the reason why I say Alabama and Ohio State is because they just seem to be the 2 schools that can go 3 deep at the position. And those are the games in which they give, those running back 2, running back 3s, wide receiver 3, 4, and 5. They give them that playing time, right? And so I don't know if any other school in the country, any other schools are as deep as Alabama and Ohio State when it comes to mismatches. Yeah. Alabama plays Mercer. Do you want to start Brian Robinson? Then I think that's a little bit of a discussion. But Arkansas versus Arkansas Pine Bluff, Oklahoma versus Kansas. I mean, Oklahoma's not a given to beat anybody this year. And look, I saw some discussions about whether or not to start Jerome Ford against Navy. Navy played Cincinnati to within 7 points last week. Jerome Ford, 90 yards and a touchdown. That was one of his worst weeks in about 4 or 5 weeks. And you're going to hit some and you're going to lose some, right? I mean, look at the guys that started. Maybe they took a stab at Jordan Travis last week. The projections were really had projected a big week for Jordan Travis. I think he finished on about 18 fantasy points in that route of UMass, but that's going to happen sometimes. I would much rather start my good players, a player that has a really great matchup, than to start a player against Georgia every week. That's just my feeling. And so I'm hoping that this message sticks and we remember it when it goes on later in the year, or we carry this forward into the 2022 season. I've never been a fan of sitting your stud players even against below average competition, because you just never know what's going to happen in college football now. And like I said, to my point, and I'm going to say it, I'm going to say it one more time. I'd rather start Arkansas players versus Arkansas Pine Bluff than Arkansas players versus Georgia every week of the year. And I think that game right there really just kind of proved my point a little bit. Yeah, that we're going to miss some. Jordan Travis, yeah. Caleb Williams didn't have the greatest game, but no one saw Kansas play in Oklahoma that tough. And I think a lot of you guys that have Caleb Williams, first and foremost, great matchup. But that was a first half that really, I mean, you were really lucky to get out of that game with Caleb Williams, what you came away with, right? But to that point, he still produced and he still came through. And you don't sit your stud players I would rather Caleb Williams play Kansas every single week than to play a solid defense. That's just my thought. Like I said before, Alabama, Ohio State, maybe we have to worry about it there. But I don't think any other school you sit a stud player on the roster. And so that's my opinion. That's my take on starting your star players, even in the matchups that seem lopsided on paper. If they're going to go for 40-something points, there's a really good chance that the studs are going to do something early, and they're going to give you points early. And as we saw in Arkansas versus Arkansas Pine Bluff, that happened. So with that being said, we're going to move on. Like I said, the 4-1 league, I'll catch up with you guys next week when we get that scoring updated. But we're going to jump into the matchups, right? And we're going to do it a little different. We're going to go by conference. And instead of just throwing out there 3 to 6 names per matchup on, we pretty much know what we're going to get. I'm going to look at maybe the biggest question for each game, or for the important games I feel that are of the most fantasy relevance for this given week 9. And we're going to start we're just going to go alphabetical order by conference, the American Conference. South Florida at East Carolina. For me, can Jaron Mangum still continue his role? 6 consecutive games with a touchdown, 5 of the last 6 games with at least 2 scores. I think he's a must start this week. And I think when you look on the other side of the ball with East Carolina and you look at their schedule, the Pirates are 3-4. The 3 losses: Appalachian State, no shame there. South Carolina, decent SEC defense. Road games at Central Florida, at Houston. You look at their 3 wins: Marshall, Charleston Southern, and home against Tulane. They get South Florida, they get Temple back-to-back before they end with Memphis, Navy, and Cincinnati. I think for me is can ECU get the ground game rolling again this week? I think Keaton Mitchell and Rajay Harris, I think this is the game where they kind of get back into the groove a little bit. And for me, I think this is a matchup where ECU can get the ground game going against South Florida at home at ECU. Navy on the road at Tulsa. I think for me, Josh Johnson, incredible season so far. We have him up there near the top 10 this week. That's where he landed in the projections. Very solid play. Let's see if he can continue that role this week. Central Florida on the road at Temple. We saw Isaiah Bowser come back, look healthy last week, 20-plus carries. Will he get 20-plus carries again this week? And if so, can he find you a couple of scores? I think that's what I'm looking for this week. We may not get Jalen Robinson back yet. And so that kind of leaves O'Keefe and Robinson as the 2 top targets at receiver. And I think those might be some good options for you as well. Cincinnati at Tulane. We know Tulane's going to get a heavy dose of Jerome Ford. Will Tulane be competitive enough that Desmond Ridder will have to get in on the act, maybe become a little bit more active? That is the one thing that, and I know I've said it a few weeks back, Desmond Ridder, when they need him, he shows up. In these matchups, they really haven't need him. He's not doing as much damage with his legs as we thought he would at the beginning of the year, but quite frankly, Cincinnati hasn't needed him to. And so I think from this game, if Cincinnati breaks out early, this could be another one of those matchups where they carry that running, where the running game carries them. Desmond Ridder does some things through the air, but how much will he do on the ground? That remains to be seen in a matchup that I think Cincinnati can dominate. And I'm not sure yet Wednesday night if Michael Pratt will be cleared for that game. I think he had some concussion protocol stuff going on, so it'll be curious to see if that happens. Players have not had a really good success rate of playing the following week in which they suffer some type of concussion. It seems like it's almost a given that most players miss at least one game. So caution flag is up for you guys with Michael Pratt. SMU on the road at Houston. For me, the big question here with Ulysses S. Bentley out, and this was in my notes and observations, are some of you guys holding on to him? Are some of you guys dropping him and moving on? Some of you guys may be have your hands tied. You may not want to tie up a roster spot right now because you're a little desperate for a win. And the way that Trey Siggers is playing right now, I don't necessarily know that Bentley comes in and really shoves him out of the way immediately anyway. But let's look at it. Ulysses Bentley had 2 carries. SMU had a bye. He comes back next week. He really hasn't played, which means that injury is probably a lot worse than what we were led to believe. So I think that job right now, it's pretty safe. It's safely in the hands of Trey Siggers right now, and I think he's a good play this week. Let's go over to the ACC where Virginia Tech goes to Georgia Tech. Big question in this game. Look, Jahmyr Gibbs has some things going right now, but I think the biggest question in this game and where a lot of emails coming in, what about Malachi Thomas for Virginia Tech? 21 carries, 151 yards, 3 touchdowns in that 41-36 loss at home to Syracuse last week. This is one of those situations where I really feel you need to be careful. This is one of those situations where I feel maybe you're chasing points with Malachi Thomas. Could he have that type of game again? Sure, it's possible. But before that, his season high was 6 carries for 33 yards. And I even made note of this last week. Raheem Blackshear even had 78 yards last week against Syracuse. That was 25 more yards than Raheem Blackshear had in a game all season long. So that Virginia, the question is, was that performance against Syracuse more an anomaly, or will it be a little bit more of the norm? And until we see a little bit more consistency out of that Virginia Tech offense, I'm leaning more with the side that I just don't have enough confidence right now in leaning on Malachi Thomas as a starting running back this week. Now, if you have the roster spot and you want to pick him up and you want to stash him away because you want to hold on to him if there's a chance that he sticks and has that type of, then I'm all for that. That's the type of move that I like to make. I caution you guys on starting him this week when we really only have a 1-game sample size. You have to remember, if you don't have anything this week, the matchups in the coming weeks aren't that bad. At Boston College and Duke are the next 2 matchups. They go at Miami and then they end at Virginia, right? So that you've got at least 3 decent matchups right there over the last 4 games of the year that if Thomas does stick, you can use him. I just don't want to get into a situation where you start him over a quality starter on your bench and then you get burned. Now, this may, the philosophy may blow up in my face. As I mentioned, sometimes we hit, sometimes we miss. But in my experience, you've got to be careful with these guys that come out of nowhere and have these big 1-week hits on duplicating that production the following week. And so there's my take on the Malachi Thomas situation and the game plan for him for this week and the 4 weeks after. For me, he's more of a sit, watch, and decide whether or not he's going to be a long-term option. Because if he has 25 yards this week, doesn't find the end zone, then a lot of you guys maybe have wasted a roster move, but you've also taken a chance on a guy that could explode at the end of the year as well. So I like picking him up. Be careful starting him this week. Miami on the road at Pitt. I think the biggest question here is just how healthy is Pitt going to be? I think Ikanabanda, the running back, and Jordan Addison are both questionable, both maybe in concussion protocol. That makes me nervous, as I just mentioned, my deal on concussion. Look, concussions are good and bad in 2 ways, right? Well, first of all, it's never good for someone's health. But the thing that I've noticed is that most guys that go into concussion protocol usually miss the next game the following week. It seems like more guys than not miss the next game, and then they come back 2 games later. The good thing about concussions is that there's no question when they come back and you get the report that they're out there on the field warming up, dressed, running out with the pregame starters, that they're playing. It's one of the only, it may be the only injury where we get 100% clarity on whether or not they're going to play or not before a game. If there's some type, ankle, arm, shoulder, knee, we don't know. There have been a number of times where players have dressed, gone through warm-ups, dressed up, come out of the tunnel and dressed, and then not play. And either we didn't know what was going on, or they had a nagging injury and we thought that they were back healthy because they looked pretty good in pregame, and then you get burned and then not play. With at least with concussion, when they're clear 100%, because you're not cleared for a concussion at 75 and 80%. You're either 100% cleared or you're not. And when you clear the concussion, there is no other body part that is affected by the injury. So those guys are full go. So that's why I say concussion is the best and it's the worst injury, because usually guys miss a week with a concussion, but when they come back, we know that they're a full go. And that clarity is what we need more than anything when we're talking college fantasy football starting lineups, particularly when we go through the injury situations that we do each and every week. Florida State on the road at Clemson. Big question here is, what is Clemson going to do at quarterback? For you guys that are holding on to Will Shipley, I think this could be a nice play for him this week. I can only imagine how big his numbers would have been if he'd have been able to hold on to that pass down the seam. Probably would have gone for about a 60 or 70-yard touchdown, and he basically let it flip right out of his hands. So his numbers could have been better, and I think Clemson may ride that ground game this week. This could be a good week for you Will Shipley owners this week. Boston College on the road at Syracuse, and for me, the big question is can Garrett Schrader and Sean Tucker just keep that 1-2 punch going on the ground for Syracuse? I think so. I think both of those guys are going to keep it going. The Syracuse offense looks good with both of those guys, and I think the big question is will they keep it going? And for me, short answer is yes. Duke on the road at Wake Forest. What we get is Duke. I mean, last week, 70 points in the matchup against Army. Keep in mind, they still gave up 50 plus, right? And so can Duke get things going this week? The biggest surprise for Duke last week is that they didn't score a point against a Virginia defense that has given up a boatload of points this year, particularly in ACC play. That was a shocker for me more than anything. Can Mateo Durant, can Gunnar Holmberg get that offense going this week and get some points on the board? I think Duke will be able to score some points against Wake Forest, and that should bode well for you Mateo Durant owners. Louisville on the road at NC State. Remember, Malik Cunningham had, his consecutive, he went for a number of weeks where he ran for at least 2 touchdowns, right? So let me go ahead and pull this up. So Malik Cunningham had rushed for at least 2 scores in each of the Cardinals' first 5 games. He was not able to do that against Virginia, but came back last week, 3 rushing scores. Can he continue that streak going? Because for me right now, he's the only fantasy play in that Louisville offense. North Carolina on the road at Notre Dame. This is a real interesting matchup. It seems like when you look at the Notre Dame schedule, Notre Dame's another team. They kind of, I kind of throw them and lump them into the same bucket as Oklahoma right now. They just don't impress me at all. But they're catching team. I mean, North Carolina is 4-3. I would have thought that North Carolina was going to be much better than they have been, right? Notre Dame lost to Cincinnati. They won at Wisconsin. This is one of the worst Wisconsin teams that I can remember in a long time. They barely beat Virginia Tech by 3. They beat Toledo by 3, escaped that. They beat Florida State at the beginning of the year by 3, and that's not a good Florida State team. You're looking at the schedule at Notre Dame. They've got North Carolina, Navy, Virginia, Georgia Tech, and at Stanford. I mean, I don't even know where they're going to lose another game. If they do, maybe it's this week because North Carolina could put some points on the board. Maybe it's at Stanford. Maybe it's at Virginia. But I don't know. I don't really look at a team on Notre Dame's schedule and see where they're going to lose another game. I could be wrong. It's been, college football. It's been a crazy year. But I think Kyron Williams, for me, big week this week, and can Sam Howell and Josh Downs continue that link up that they have to produce, a nice connection there against on the road at Notre Dame, where I think it's going to be a little tough for them. But Josh Downs is a must start every week. And then Virginia going on the road at BYU, the Bronco Mendenhall Bowl, right? And so we know that we're probably going to get Virginia slinging around for 300 plus. Brennan Armstrong, one of the top quarterback plays again this week. Dontavius Wicks, one of the top receivers. Can BYU and Tyler Algier get that running game going against Virginia? I think they can. I think this could be a big week for Tyler Algier, and that's the matchup that I'm watching this week. And that's the last game through the ACC slate. Let's hop over to the Big 12, Texas on the road at Baylor. I think this could be a tough matchup for Texas. But Bijan Robinson is one of the top fantasy backs in the country, one of the top running backs in the country, is going to be a must start this week. And then remember what we saw with Baylor last game. Abram Smith, they gave him 27 carries for 188 yards. That's my big question going into this matchup. Are they going to give Abram Smith another heavy workload against that Texas defense? If they do, then I really like his chances to put up some really big numbers this week in that running back spot against the Longhorns. Iowa State going on the road at West Virginia. Iowa State, big win last week against Oklahoma State. Can Breece Hall get things going on the road at West Virginia? Can Xavier Hutchinson follow up another big week as well? And then what about Letty Brown against that Iowa State defense? For me, this looks like one of those matchups where you may only get 60 or 70 yards from Letty Brown, but if West Virginia does find the end zone, there's a really good chance that Letty Brown's going to score a touchdown. If they find the end zone 2 or 3 times, there's a chance he's going to at least have one of them. And so I think with a home matchup for West Virginia, you still have to get Letty Brown in there, and hopefully he can give you 3 or 4 catches out of the backfield. TCU on the road at Kansas State. And for me, is this matchup going to be as sweet for Deuce Vaughn as it looks on paper? I think he's one of the top fantasy plays this week. But I think here's the real question for me in this matchup, and it's on the TCU side. I've been very outspoken about Quentin Johnston for TCU. I've been very outspoken about how I would not want another player on the TCU roster, maybe other than Zach Evans this year, because that passing game just doesn't show any consistency whatsoever week to week. We've gone now we've gone consecutive weeks now where Quentin Johnston has topped the century mark. He had 3 touchdowns a couple of weeks ago. He went for 5 catches, 113 this past week against West Virginia. Will we see him do it again this week? Or will his fantasy owners fall for another dud? And I think that's the biggest question. This really could, in my opinion, Quentin Johnston this week really could determine whether or not he's a legitimate fantasy option for you down the stretch, because I don't think you can take a chance with a player over the last 3 weeks of the season that could give you a dud. But if he can turn it on and give you a third consistent performance, we might be onto something with a TCU receiver as we head down the stretch here in this 2021 fantasy season. Texas Tech on the road at Oklahoma. I just want to see, I said this a few weeks ago that I didn't want anybody off of the Oklahoma offense besides Kennedy Brooks. The insertion of Caleb Williams at quarterback has changed my outlook on that. Give me Caleb Williams now and Kennedy Brooks, and I think you're going to see those 2 guys ride out. I think the offense is going to ride those 2 guys this week in that matchup at home against Texas Tech. And then last Big 12 matchup of the week, Kansas on the road at Oklahoma State. Remember, like I said, don't fall for any of the weak matchups. You start your starters there. The big question for Oklahoma State, and I think this fits more in line with what's happening over at TCU as well with Quentin Johnston, where Brennan Presley was one of the top, was projected to be the top fantasy receiver for Oklahoma State, at least for our site at the beginning of the year. What we've seen now with Brennan Presley is that he's caught a touchdown pass in 3 of the last 4 games. 2 touchdown performance last week, 6 catches, 84 yards in that loss at Iowa State. He has now scored in 3 of the last 4 games. Here's the question. Will he be and do it consistently now? I have there's a little bit more faith in Brennan Presley than I have with Quentin Johnston right now, because we've seen Presley at least find the end zone in 3 of the last 4. But the question I have with Presley is right here. Have we missed a boat on him already? For a guy that didn't catch a touchdown pass over the first 3 weeks of the season, he did catch a touchdown pass in his 4th game, but he only had 2 catches for 53 yards. He followed that up with a 1-catch, 10-yard performance. Did we just miss the boat on Brennan Presley? He had a 2-week run. That's what I fear right now. I feel that we may be chasing points with Brennan Presley. I don't have enough confidence in him to really suggest starting him. But based on the matchups, you may have to. And this is a real easy matchup. And I think that, the matchup is as good as it's going to get to maybe find the end zone for the 3rd time or to find the end zone for the 4th time in 5 weeks. So I do think that you can roll with him, but there's a little bit of nervousness right there with Brennan Presley as well. But I feel a little bit better about Brennan Presley than I do about Quentin Johnston, just because of the Oklahoma State offense. Usually when Oklahoma State's offense shows some consistency, things go that way. Tay Martin established himself early, got hurt, came back, but we know what that outside wide receiver one does in that Oklahoma State offense. We know what Oklahoma State's going to do when they feed their running back one. Will we see the emergence of Brennan Presley here down? We've seen the emergence of him, but will we see that consistency down the stretch? That's my big question in this matchup. And that's why I think he's a questionable start. Evaluate your roster, but I tend to lean more on the good flex option in this matchup against Kansas. That's going to do it for the Big 12, guys. So let's go ahead, we're going to go hop over into the Big 10. Indiana at Maryland. Here's something that I'm really interested in this matchup right here. I'm curious to see if this, not curious, but I think this could be a decent week for a guy like Stephen Carr, running back of Indiana. And here's why I say this. When you look at Indiana's schedule this year, they only have 2 wins. They opened with a loss at Iowa, tough defense. 2 weeks later, they lose at home to Cincinnati, another solid defense. After a win at Western Kentucky, they lose at Penn State, another good defense. They lose to Michigan State 2015, another solid defense. And then they lose 54-7 to Ohio State. And compared to Indiana, Ohio State is a good defense. Their 2 wins were against Idaho at Western Kentucky. And now they get Maryland. And Maryland's defense isn't that great. And so I think this is a matchup. This is a sneaky play for some Indiana players this week. Maybe Stephen Carr. Maybe he's out there on the waiver wire. Maybe that's your 1-week pickup this week. Maybe Stephen Carr, maybe Ty Freifogel, maybe Peyton Hendershot at tight end. But I think this could be a sneaky matchup for the guys that have Maryland players this week. That's what I'm looking for in this matchup. Rutgers on the road at Illinois. Will we get Chase Brown another heavy dose this week? 200-plus yards in 2 of the last 3. Hopefully that train will keep going, and it's a good matchup this week at home against Rutgers, and I think you ride Brown while he's hot. Michigan at Michigan State. Real interesting matchup here. It's going to be defense, and I think, who's going to be able to make a play in the passing game. Michigan State has more at receivers. I don't know what's going to go on here fantasy-wise. Blake Corum, Hassan Haskins, Kenneth Walker III. I think you've really got to evaluate your situation on whether or not you want to start any of those guys. I have a lot more faith in Kenneth Walker III, and the reason why I say that for 2 reasons. One, there is no chance that he's splitting carries with anyone in the backfield like Corum and Haskins will. And we saw what Ramir Johnson was at least able to do against that Michigan defense not that long ago when they played at Nebraska. And so maybe Kenneth Walker can squeeze his way through that Michigan defense. And I think of all of those players in this matchup, He's the one that I'm more likely to lean on. And over on the Michigan side, if I had to pick one back out of the two, I tend to lean Blake Corum just because I feel like he's got a little bit more big play ability than Hassan Askins. But that's it in that matchup right there for me. Iowa on the road at Wisconsin, another Big Ten matchup right here where it makes me nervous. You've got Braylon Allen really coming out, Ches Malisi at Wisconsin as well. I wrote this in my notes and observations for as good as Braylon Allen looked, he was still, Ches Malisi was given more rushing attempts than Braylon Allen. Tough matchup at home against Iowa. I think this is where you just kind of, hold on to Braylon Allen and see how this plays out in this matchup against Iowa, which I don't think it's a good matchup for Tyler Goodson either. So curious to see how you guys play this one with the depths that you have on your roster. I know Power 5 league, it's hard to sit those type of guys, but in full FBS formats, 14, 12 teams or less, my guess is you probably have some more solid, you probably have better options on your bench, and you may look the other way. But for me, it's running game in this matchup. Total only 36 points. Vegas is looking at the projected winner, not even to have 20 points this weekend. Purdue on the road at Nebraska. Can David Bell get things going again after a down week against Wisconsin, 1 week after he exploded against Iowa? Can he get things going again? Minnesota on the road at Northwestern. What's going on with the Minnesota backfield? It looked like Bryce Williams was going to be the guy. And this is why I say sometimes we really have to be careful jumping on the 1 week breakout players. They're great to get on your roster, but they're not necessarily great to start the following week. And so that's why I threw that out with Malachi Thomas over at Virginia Tech. It's great that you scooped him up, but there's no guarantee he's going to have another game like that. Bryce Williams did score. So many of you guys that did pick him up and start him last week were very fortunate to get a double-digit fantasy to get double-digit fantasy points from him last week. 48 yards and a rushing touchdown. But Marquise Irvin had 15 carries for 105 and a touchdown. You had Kai Thomas lead the team in rushing with 21 carries for 139 and a touchdown. And then, of course, you've got Cole Kramer, the quarterback, as well. He chipped in for 30 yards and a touchdown. So we just not sure where the production is going to come or who is going to get most of the carries this week. Will they lean more on the young running backs? Possibly, but there's no guarantee. And so a week ago, we were looking at Bryce Williams as possibly emerging as the new guy after Trey Potts went down. Now, as we go into the stretch of the season, we have to wonder, are they leaning more towards the young guys on the roster? Will they lean more towards Bryce Williams? Or is it going to be a situation where they're just going to ride more of the hot hand? That's where I'm looking at this weekend with Minnesota. But that's also why I'm a little nervous to start anyone this week on the road at Northwestern, which is a great matchup. But I do think you've got to choose wisely as well. And then Penn State on the road at Ohio State. One observation I want to make about this matchup, it's going to be on both sides. Remember at the beginning of the year when Minnesota basically gave Ohio State all they could have to open the season? Oregon went into Ohio State and really, they only won by 7, but it looked a lot easier than that. And then Ohio State gave up 20 points to Tulsa in a 41-20 win. And then all of a sudden, Ohio State goes on a roll. But let's keep things in context a little bit. They beat Akron, Rutgers, Maryland, and a not so good Indiana team. That's not a tough schedule. That had blowout, semi-blowout written all over it. I actually think this game could be a little bit closer than what most people think. Penn State's defense respectable. If the quarterback is healthy over for Penn State, I think Sean Clifford can make enough plays against. I think the Penn State offense can make enough plays against Ohio State to keep them in the game. I really like this matchup. Obviously all the usual suspects you're going to be starting, but over on the Penn State side, I'm not saying start Sean Clifford, But I think a player like Jahan Dotson, who didn't score last week, I think Penn State might be able to score a little bit more or more points than what I think we might. And I think a lot of that really just stems from my observation that Ohio State hasn't particularly played anyone tough over the last month. Now, that's going to wrap it up for the Big Ten. And we're going to go into Conference USA. North Texas playing on the road at Rice. Unbelievable upset. I mean, I thought it was an upset win. Rice beat UAB last week. And, you know, how big of a role will Jordan Myers play this week? I actually like this matchup for Jordan Myers. And, you know, if you got him and can start him as a tight end, I think this could be a matchup where he gets a few more carries at running back than what we used to. And of course, on the North Texas side, you know, the question is, are we going to get another heavy dose of DeAndre Torrey? There's no reason to think that we won't. Southern Miss on the road at Middle Tennessee. You know, Jaron Pierce, Chase Cunningham appear to be, you know, Jimmy Marshall, solid options in this matchup. I think they'll continue to be solid options this week in that matchup at home against Southern Miss. You know, Florida International playing on the road at Marshall. Will Rasheen Ali kind of keep things going? He's had an incredible year. We've got him ranked in the top 10 again this week. Last outing, 20 carries, 109 yards, 2 touchdowns. He has 5 multiple touchdown games this year in 7 matchups. Gone over the 100-yard mark 3 times. And I think this could be another big week for him against Florida International. Louisiana Tech playing on the road at Old Dominion. And this Louisiana Tech team is, you know, it's kind of interesting when you look at Louisiana Tech. The big question for me is what Louisiana Tech team is actually going to show up. They lost at Mississippi State by 1 point first week of the season, 35-34, in a game they probably should have won. I think Mississippi State might have scored like 21 fourth quarter points to come back and win that game. They lost to SMU 39-37 by 2 points. But then they barely beat North Texas 24-17. They lose 3 in a row. They only lose to 7 on the road at North Carolina State. They lose at UTEP 19-3, and then they lose to UTSA 45-16. Now, I don't think the teams on that schedule are that great, but maybe they've just gotten tripped up because, look, UTSA is having a good year. The UTEP defense has been playing solid. They lose at NC State. They lose SMU to 2. To me, this is one of those games where they're either going to hold true to form over the last few weeks, or maybe they finally face an Old Dominion team that maybe this is the relief that they need. Maybe this is a big week for Austin Kendall. But I have a little trepidation saying that because it seems like Old Dominion is putting some things together themselves. But I do think that this actually could be one of those games where we see more points than where the 52 point total leads us, which is basically not even 4 touchdowns per team. I think this could be one of those matchups where both teams get up in the 30s, and I'm curious to see how that one plays out. Charlotte on the road at Western Kentucky. And of course there, I think the big question is can Charlotte put some things together on offense, because they couldn't do it against Florida Atlantic in the second week last week. Can they do some things that warrant studying Greg DuBose at receiver, Victor Tucker at receiver as well? For me, I think those 2 guys are, should be in the lineup because I think they're going to have to play catch up with Western Kentucky. But the biggest question for me is Chris Reynolds going to be able to kind of keep them in that matchup and make those guys fantasy relevant late into the game when we can pretty much expect Western Kentucky to put up 40-plus points in this matchup. And then UTEP on the road at Florida Atlantic. The big question for me in this matchup, I think if I'm going to go one on each side of the ball, is can N'Kosi Perry continue to play well for FAU? And then for me, over at the running back spot for UTEP, I mentioned this in my notes and observations. It's kind of hard to settle on and have a UTEP running back on your roster right now because you don't know, is it Ronald Awatt one week? Is it going to be Deion Hankins the following week? And if they're going to jockey back and forth for top spot, maybe ride the hot hand, those are not the situations that I like to play. I like to stay away from those. And so if that's going to continue, I don't see where either of those guys are going to be valuable on your roster, and it's more of a crapshoot. And then, maybe, we talked about this in the preseason, and as the season starts, we saw Ronald Awatt emerge when Deion Hankins was injured, and then Hankins comes back, and then they cut into one another's production. And in these situations, you don't want to wish injury on either guy, but that may be what it takes for the situation to iron itself out and for one of those backs to become fantasy relevant again. It may just take one of those guys to get banged up. That's, the UTEP running back situation is more of a stay away from me right now. Let's head over from Conference USA. We'll touch on the independent matchups because there's really not a lot there. We've already talked about North Carolina, Notre Dame. We've talked about Virginia, BYU, UMass at Liberty. Biggest question is the health status of Malik Willis. How healthy is he? And for this matchup, they won't need him. Liberty's defense should be a solid play this week. But here's one of those situations where I mentioned, do you play your studs in the mismatches? And right now, remember at the beginning of the year, I think I had done some shows with some guys, and maybe this was a point that we brought out too when we were comparing Malik Willis with maybe a Matt Corral. There was a lot of debate on whether or not Malik Willis was going to last late into some of these games because their schedule just looked so easy that they were going to be able to run through. Well, so much for that idea. I mean, you're looking at a 6-2 Liberty team that really isn't running anybody out of the stadium. And so they should have no problem with UMass this weekend. But the big question is will Malik Willis play? And if he does, I think you've got to roll with him, because here's the thing. If Liberty is going to, first of all, if Malik Willis plays and he's healthy, you have to think that they're going to at least score 30-something points, if not 40-something. And whether or not they scored in the first half and he leaves, if Liberty scores 40 points, there's a good chance that Malik Willis is going to be in on 3, maybe 4 of those 5 touchdowns. And so another example of not sitting your studs in the great matchups. But the caveat to this one is Malik Willis fully healthy. And that's really the biggest question going into the matchup this weekend with Liberty playing UMass. Mid-American Conference, the MAC, we can get in and out real quick because there's only one matchup, Bowling Green at Buffalo. And the big question for me is, will we see the return of Kevin Marks, or will it, as long as Marks is out, Dylan McDuffie seems like a solid play. If Marks returns, will it be more of a split? I think until we actually see Marks play, you've got to roll with McDuffie. And so in the lone MAC matchup, he, in my opinion, is the best play in that game. Let's go over to the Mountain West Conference. UNLV on the road at Nevada. Romeo Dobbs with a breakout game last week. And I can't say breakout because it's not like he hasn't had a few of those in his career, but for the year, a big game. And so I think you kind of, for me, can he duplicate that? That's the big question, right? Can he duplicate that? And is Charles Williams gonna, will he be worth the play on the road at Nevada? Charles Williams, a UNLV team that's 0-7. When you look at Williams, he's still been able to do some things on the ground. 94 yards TD against San Jose State, 200 yards, 3 touchdowns against Utah State a couple of weeks ago. 2 weeks prior to that at Fresno State, over 100 yards and a touchdown. And I think against that Nevada defense, Charles Williams is a start. And so can Romeo Dobbs keep it going? Can he have another high performing game like that? And will Charles Williams be able to continue performing against these Mountain West Conference teams? I say yes. I say get him in. Hawaii on the road at Utah State. I think this could be a really big week for Devin Tompkins, who I have high in the rankings, and the projections spit him out that way as well. The big question really is, will Chevin Cordero return for Hawaii? I don't think Chevin Cordero is a great quarterback, but they're definitely better with Cordero at quarterback right now. And I do think that that will affect Nick Mardner. I mentioned that on last week's podcast. I think if Cordero comes back, then I think you get Mardner in the starting lineup. Without Cordero, he's a little bit of a question mark in my mind. Wyoming on the road at San Jose State. And I'm telling you, 3 weeks ago, I would say Xavier Valladay and Tyler Nevins were must starts in this game. Now I'm curious to see where the offense is even going to come from. You got a total of 41 points in this matchup. That's a projected 20-20 score, 21-19 score. It's still a little bit of a risk in a game that I don't think is going to score many points. I've watched San Jose State play over the last few weeks without Nick Starkel. The offense doesn't look good at all. The running game looks terrible. UNLV was manhandling them up front. Tyler Nevins couldn't get things going. Yes, Nick Nash was able to move out of the pocket and get things going with his legs, but the running backs, Tyler Nevins, couldn't do anything. Wyoming 4-3 right now. They couldn't do much against a New Mexico team. They lose 14-3 against New Mexico. I don't have a lot of confidence in either one of these offenses right now. If I had to pick one player from this game that I would start, it would probably be tight end Derek Deese, who I think is phenomenal. I saw that. I've watched him play. The guy has hands unreal. And if there's a 2B player, I might roll with Xavier Valladay and take my chances with him. But for me, Derek Deese is the only play worth having in tight end only leagues. Boise State on the road at Colorado State. Khalil Shakir now is not the Khalil Shakir of the beginning of the season. This is a road matchup at Colorado State. I think the Rams can play him tough, and I do think you get David Bailey in the lineup this week. I think that Boise State run defense can be had a little bit on the ground, and I do think that Bailey has a chance to go for 100 yards in a touchdown and in what on paper looks like a tough matchup. But I think that Bailey is still a safe play, and of course Trey McBride. But that's the big question for me: is what Khalil Shakir are we going to see? And will we see David Bailey continue to roll on the ground? Fresno State on the road at San Diego State. And for me, this is a real interesting matchup to talk about. You know, I sometimes when you look at teams and you look at the matchups over the course of the season, like I did with Ohio State earlier in the show, I did it with Indiana, and you look at the schedule, sometimes it takes 6-7 weeks into the season before we see some trend that we might be able to say, I found something. Maybe this is the week that this happens. And so let me tell you what I'm seeing with San Diego State. We're going to see how this unfolds. San Diego State 7-0, right? Let's run down their schedule. They beat New Mexico State. They win at Arizona. They did beat Utah 33-31. They gave up 31 points. And at the time, Utah was still kind of figuring themselves out. I'd say they're much better today than they are back then. I think Utah today might actually beat San Diego State. But for the sake of conversation, let's keep this going and on track. Then they beat Townsend. Then they beat New Mexico, right? And then they win at San Jose State 19-13. And that San Jose State team has not impressed me at all. Then they win at Air Force 20-14, right? Now that was a good win. Air Force is a solid team, but let's keep this in mind. New Mexico State, Arizona, Utah, Townsend, New Mexico, San Jose State, Air Force. None of those teams can bring to the table offensively what Fresno State can. So this is a home matchup for San Diego State. And I think that makes this game really close. But this is an offense. San Diego State's defense has not seen an offense like Fresno State's this year. Now, we can also, what's the one thing we do know? Fresno State has lost at Oregon. They still scored 24 points at Oregon. They scored 40 points in a road game at UCLA. They won 17-0 on the road at Wyoming. That does have a decent defense. But we've seen Fresno State move the ball against good teams. We haven't seen San Diego State play an offense like Fresno State. And I'm curious to see how this matchup plays out. Haener is not one of our top quarterbacks for the week. Cropper is not one of the top receivers this week, but they're up there. right? And I do think you have to, I still think that you start those guys this week. I could be completely wrong. We could be coming back next week and saying that I completely missed this, but San Diego State for me hasn't been impressive enough to say that we should sit Hainer or we should sit Jalen Cropper this week. And so I think you roll with those guys. Let's hop out of the Mountain West Conference and over to the Pac-12, Washington State at Arizona State. Big question here is for me, is Rachaad White healthy? Is he going to play? Looks like he returned to practice. I know he had missed some time, but for me, it's all about, can Arizona State keep that running game going? I thought it would be a lot better than what it has been up until this point, 7 games into the season. And really, I think another question that may have a bigger impact on fantasy production is, will Deion McIntosh return for Washington State? Because without McIntosh, that makes Max Borghi a much more attractive fantasy play on that Washington State side. Colorado at Oregon. Here we go again. Another one of those matchups where Oregon should have no problem running through Colorado, but with the way that the Ducks have looked on offense over the past couple of weeks, particularly since CJ Verdell went down, I think you've got to get Travis Dye in there. And if there's a chance that Oregon goes up 28-0 early, there's a pretty good chance based on what we've seen that Dye is going to figure into half of those touchdowns. And so I do think he's a must start this week at home against Colorado. Oregon State on the road at Cal. And for me, the biggest question here is, can BJ Baylor just keep things going on the ground for Oregon State? Arizona playing on the road at USC. Arizona hasn't looked good at all. We know what Drake London is going to give us, probably double-digit catches this week, probably a touchdown, and probably over 100 yards rushing. Over 100 yards receiving. But for me, the big question here is, what about Keontae Ingram, who all of a sudden over the last 4 weeks has been much more of a fantasy factor? 4 games ago, 79 yards, 2 touchdowns. Then he had 124 against Colorado. He went for 70 against Utah. That was respectable. Last week at Notre Dame, 138 yards and a touchdown. And I do think that Keontae Ingram is a start this week at home against Arizona. UCLA on the road at Utah. The biggest question here in this matchup is, will DTR be healthy? Will he play? And I think that really does significantly change the outcome for, or at least the fantasy outlook for the Bruins this week, particularly running back Zach Charbonnet, Britton Brown, in that UCLA offense, and how many points they can score on the road at Utah. And then Washington at Stanford. Washington's offense just doesn't, it looked like they were turning a corner a couple of weeks ago, but it looks like the Washington team last week, that Washington offense looked like the Washington offense that played on the road at Michigan, where I was very had a few choice words for that Washington offense for how bad they looked. And I don't see anything different this week on the road at Stanford. And really, for me, what's going to go on with the Stanford passing game? I don't like the running game at Stanford, but will Higgins and make enough plays in the passing game? How will they use Austin Jones, who against Washington State, Austin Jones had he caught 9 passes for 75 yards, and then the tight end Ben Yurosich. I think those are the 3 guys that you're going to look to get in, but I'm a little more hesitant on Austin Jones, because it seems like it's got to be catches or nothing, because he's not going to give you much in the running game. Let's get out of the Pac-12 and then go over to the SEC, where Missouri playing on the road at Vanderbilt. And so Tyler Beatty, one of the top running backs of the week this week. Big question for me is, what about Rocco Griffin? All of a sudden now, his season high against Connecticut, 77 yards and a touchdown. I threw his name out that week. This is another week where he has a good matchup against a bad run defense, and I'm wondering if he might be one of those 1-week gems for you. And so I think you've got to look at Rocco Griffin this week at home against Missouri if you need a 1-week replacement at the running back or a flex spot. Georgia on the road at Florida. Look, here's my take on this game, and I'll just have a take on it because it is a big matchup within the SEC, particularly for Georgia, because this might be their toughest matchup between now and the SEC championship game. whenever you're facing Dan Mullen, you never know what to expect. That for me is what makes this game so intriguing. Is that Dan Mullen, one of the best, I think, offensive minds in when it comes to game planning in all of college football. And so, will we see Anthony Richardson really for a full 60 minutes in this matchup? That remains to be seen. And over on the Georgia side, who plays quarterback? And here's my take here. I don't know how you get away from Stetson Bennett at this point. I feel like it's his team. I mean, I don't feel that JT Daniels has done enough to take the job away from Stetson Bennett. Georgia's looked good. They've looked solid all around. Stetson Bennett has done nothing to make me think that he can't continue to keep Georgia, rolling right now. And quite honestly, with the way that defense is playing, they just need Stetson Bennett to be Stetson Bennett. And so I don't know how you go back to JT Daniels at this point. I think you have to stay with Stetson Bennett and ride it out. Georgia has looked like the best team in the country by far. 8 weeks through the season. I don't know how you change chemistry now and get away from Stetson Bennett and go to JT Daniels. That's my take on that. I'm going to stick with it. We'll see how that plays out this weekend. Ole Miss on the road at Auburn. We do have Matt Corral up there near the top 10. I think he might be just inside the top 10, but this matchup does make me a little nervous for Ole Miss. And I'll tell you why, because they're limping right now, particularly at wide receiver, right? Braylon Sanders, Jonathan Mingo. I mean, it's amazing what that Mingo injury did, but it was like dominoes falling. It's really affected the offense. They've become run heavy, and then you see Matt Corral get banged up. And you just wonder how healthy is the Ole Miss offense right now. They come walking wounded into Auburn right now. Auburn's coming off of a bye week, and Brian Harsin's really good at preparing his team when you give him enough time. And I'm curious to see how this matchup plays out. I do think that this is a matchup that Ole Miss may struggle a little bit on the road at Auburn. I'm curious to see how this plays out, but I think this game could be a lot closer. Auburn's a 2-point favorite. Ole Miss, I think, could easily win this game, but I think Auburn could just as easily win as well. And I think that's why you're seeing it as a 2-point favorite for Auburn, is that Ole Miss is just banged up walking into Auburn right now. And then Kentucky on the road at Mississippi State. A lot of the questions on whether or not Will Rogers play in last week. He did play. I think you've got to get him in this week. Tougher matchup at home against Kentucky. I don't think Kentucky's going to give up much on the ground, but you still have to like Will Rogers' chances at 300 yards and 3 touchdowns this week. And so I do think he's definitely another start in that SEC matchup against Kentucky. Last conference on the slate, Sun Belt Conference, and it was a big announcement. They added a bunch of teams to the conference, and that Sun Belt Conference, here's something that I said out in the Discord, and something that I believe. I just believe that the Sun Belt Conference is sneaky good when it comes to some of the better teams in their conference. We saw that last year in non-conference play. When Louisiana beat Iowa State. I think there was an upset where maybe might have been Arkansas State went into Kansas State. And it's not that those teams are consistently good every year, but Coastal Carolina is good. Appalachian State is a good program. And then all of a sudden you're adding a James Madison to the mix. That's only going to make the Sun Belt better. And here's my argument. I think the Sun Belt is, first of all, the MAC conference is the worst conference in all of football. I think the Sun Belt Conference is better than Conference USA. I think they're making a run now with the migration of AAC teams into the Big 12. There's an argument that the Sun Belt Conference is better than the American Conference now. And, with the way things go out over bowl season, I'm curious to see, but there's a good chance that the upper teams in the Sun Belt Conference are better than some of the better teams in the Mountain West Conference. And so I do think that the Sun Belt Conference is working their way up the ladder. Some of those teams at the bottom are really bad, but every conference has their bad teams. But I'm really excited for the Sun Belt and see where that conference goes over the next couple of years. But Coastal Carolina with a bounce back game at home against Troy, and that's really it. Can they bounce back? Can that offense bounce back against Troy? Texas State playing on the road at Louisiana Lafayette. Are we starting to see now the two-headed monster running back that we thought we were going to see from the Louisiana offense? It's taken us a little while to get there, but it looks like Chris Smith, Montrell Johnson are starting to emerge, and that Louisiana offense is evolving into an efficient offense running the ball now. And we'll see if those two guys can keep things going against Texas State. Louisiana Monroe on the road at Appalachian State. how will we see the running back rotation in this? I mentioned this in the notes and observations. Dietrich Harrington and Nate Noel, heavy, they split a bunch of carries last week, but it was Cameron Peoples who was the biggest producer for fantasy points with his 2 rushing touchdowns. How are we going to see that rotation play out this week? Or will we see more of Cameron Peoples assume the bigger role if he's healthier now? I think the one thing that we have to really acknowledge that I haven't acknowledged up until this point this year is just how Terry Bowden and Rich Rodriguez have really turned a corner at Louisiana Monroe. I was really doubting them at the beginning of the year. And then they go ahead and they beat Troy. They got blown out, and that was kind of overlooked because they lose at Coastal Carolina 59-6. They lose to Georgia State 55-21, but all of a sudden they beat Liberty 31-28. They beat South Alabama 41-31. And all of a sudden now, Chandler Rogers, quarterback, has thrown at least 2 touchdowns in 3 consecutive games. He's run for at least 40 yards now in 4 consecutive games. So put Chandler Rogers on your radar. I don't think this is a great matchup for them this week on the road at Appalachian State. But Louisiana Monroe gets Texas State and Arkansas State over the next couple of weeks. Yeah, they do play Louisiana and Louisiana Lafayette, but there might be a sneaky player in Louisiana Monroe on that roster for you over the next couple of weeks. So see how this week plays out, see what the health status of that offense is. And I do think that you might have an option there over the next couple of weeks with a UL Monroe player. And that's something that I didn't think we'd be saying after the first couple of weeks of the season. Arkansas State playing on the road at South Alabama. I think it's all about, will Jalen Tolbert keep the numbers running up over at receiver? And how will that Arkansas State offense look? Lane Hatcher's exclusively, getting the snaps now. They're playing on the road at South Alabama. Can those wide receivers for Arkansas State make enough plays, hold on to the ball? I think that's the biggest question in this matchup. And then Georgia State playing on the road at Georgia Southern. And this is going to be the last matchup that we're going to discuss. And for me, Georgia State, really one of the teams that I just haven't been able to really grasp what's going on. I mean, when you think about going into the season with Cornelius Brown, Destin Coates at running back, Cornelius McCoy and Sam Pinkney at wide receiver, that team's completely different. They look completely different. It's been Granger at quarterback. Tucker Gregg is taken over at running back. All of a sudden now you can't find Cornelius McCoy and Sam Pinkney at receiver. This offense has completely given themselves a facelift compared to what we thought we were going to see in 2021. But I do think that that Darren Granger is worth a look in this matchup, maybe even Tucker Gregg as well. I just don't know what to expect right now from consistency from the Georgia State receivers, and that's going to run us through the entire Week 9 slate. That's it, conference by conference, some of the bigger questions. I don't know if this week's show was a little bit shorter or longer because of the changed format, and I know that I had the commentary in the beginning in regards to starting your studs against the not so good FBS teams, FCS teams, but that was it, guys. Look, we're coming down on the stretch. I said it in the beginning of the show. I'll say it again. When you send your questions in, lineups, it's not just about comparing player A to player B. I'll give you a like-for-like comparison. Most of the times I'll go to the projections, but, if this is, you want some advice on a flex spot, my question is do you have to play conservative? Do you need to be a little bit more aggressive? Are you, sitting on a 3-5 record right now, maybe 4-4, maybe you're playing one of the top teams in your league and you've got to be a little aggressive, or are you sitting there 7-1 right now and playing against a team that's 2-6, and you just want to make sure that you don't get tripped up here because you're playing for a top seed, and it might be that you need to play a little bit more conservatively. That type of context on your emails, on your questions, on your DMs, they matter. Send them in. Get them over to me. Try not to get them in. I get so many in Saturday morning with keeping up with the news and trying to answer your emails. There are some that I just cannot get to before kickoff. I apologize for that. But as I've mentioned a few weeks ago, I'll mention it again. If you have questions, Thursday and Friday are definitely days to get them in. If you have any questions, send them over to me. Give me as much detail as you can. I'll give you a well thought out answer, give you my perspective on it. Hopefully it helps you out, make a decision on which way you want to lean. But that's it, guys. That's going to do it for the Week 8 show. When I see you, some of you guys, we're going to be talking playoffs right around the corner next week. I'll see you guys next week.